ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवती उत्तमा श्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्ठिकी। Reading from chapter 7, Knowledge of the Absolute, verse number 21. Yaha yam tanum bhaktaha yo yam tanum bhaktaha shraddhaya architum ichhati shraddhayarchitum ichhati tasya achalam shraddham tasyachalam shraddham tam eva vidadhami aham tam eva vidadhami aham yo yam tanum bhaktaha श्रद्धया अर्चितुम इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां ताम एव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धया अर्चितुम इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धयार्चितुम् इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धयार्चितुम् इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धयार्चितुम् इच्छति तस्याचलं श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धयार्चितुम् इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् यो यां तनुं भक्तः श्रद्धयार्चितुम् इच्छति तस्याचलां श्रद्धां तामेव विदधामि अहम् Online. Yo yo yam yam tanum bhaktaha Shraddhaya architum ichchati Tasya tasya chalam shraddham Tameva vidadhami aham Yo yo yam yam tanum bhaktaha Shraddhaya architum ichchati Tasya tasya chalam shraddham Tameva vidadhami aham Yo yo yam yam tanum bhaktaha Shraddhaya architum ichchati Tasya tasya chalam shraddham Tameva vidadhami aham Yo yo yam yam tanum bhaktaha Shraddhaya architam ichchati Tasya tasya chalam shraddham Tameva vidadhami aham. Word to word meaning. Yaha that. Yam which. Yam which. Just one moment. Tanum, form of the demigods. Bhaktaha, devotee. Shraddhaya, with faith. Architum, to worship. Ichchati, desires. Tasya, of that. Tasya, of that. Achalam, steady. Shraddham, faith. Tam, him. Eva, surely. Vidadhami, give. Aham, I. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada.
Jai Srila Prabhupada.
Translation. I am in everyone's heart as the super soul. As soon as one desires to worship the demigods, I make his faith steady so that he can devote himself to some particular deity. Translation with repetition. I am in everyone's heart as the super soul. As soon as one desires to worship the demigods, I make his faith steady so that he can devote himself to some particular deity. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Jai Srila Prabhupada. God has given independence to everyone. Therefore, if a person desires to have material enjoyment and wants very sincerely to have such facilities from the material demigods, the Supreme Lord as Super Soul in everyone's heart understands and gives facilities to such persons. As the Supreme Father of all living entities, He does not interfere with their independence, but gives all facilities so that they can fulfill their material desires. Some may ask why the all-powerful God gives facilities to the living entities for enjoying this material world and so lets them fall into the trap of the illusory energy. The answer is that if the Supreme Lord, as Super Soul, does not give such facilities, then there is no meaning to independence. Therefore, he gives everyone full independence, whatever one likes. But his ultimate instruction we find in the Bhagavad Gita: man should give up all other engagements and fully surrender unto him. That will make man happy. Thus ends the Transcendental Bhaktivedanta purport. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Presthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhakti Vedanta Swami Niti Namine. Namaste Saraswate Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, devotees. So we are in the 7th chapter of Bhagavad Gita and almost towards the last sections of this chapter. And in this section, starting from the last verse, which is verse number 20, till about another 3 more verses, till about 23 verses, 20 to 23 verses of this chapter, they are talking about demigod worship. And Lord Krishna is instructing Arjuna about who are these people who are worshipping the demigods. So we saw in verse number 19, those devotees are called as Mahatmas who understand Jnanavan Mam Prapadyate, who Vasudevam Sarvamiti, Sa Mahatma Sudurlabhaha. So those people who are in knowledge can surrender into the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and they are known as Mahatmas, or the great souls. But starting verse 20, Lord is also describing about people who do not surrender to the Supreme Lord, but they actually surrender to Anya Devataha. They surrender to some other demigods. And why do they do that? That was explained in the last verse. Kamaistaister hitagnanaha. So hitagnanaha means distorted mind. Prabhupada translates in the translation, those whose minds are distorted by material desires. So kamaha. So because of material desires, and their minds are distorted by them, and therefore they surrender into Anya Devataha, some other demigods. And they worship according to their modes of material nature, whatever they are in contact with. Accordingly, they develop some kind of worship, and they worship one of the demigods. Now in this verse, this is today's verse, Lord is further instructing Arjuna, is how is that they are developing this faith in worshipping these demigods. So there are some, as we saw, there are 4 kinds of people who develop faith, who gradually make advancement in their, who are pious and who can come and surrender to the Supreme Lord. And there are 4 kinds of people who do not surrender to the Supreme Lord. And here we are seeing there are some people who are surrendering unto the demigods, who are taking shelter of demigods. Now, how is that is happening? How is that they are developing this attraction or faith to worship the demigods? So that is being mentioned in this verse. So it is said, yo yo yam yam tanum bhaktaha. So Prabhupada is translating the word tanum, which usually refers body, but the form of the demigods. So as we saw in the previous verse, there is a description of the demigods, Anya Devataha. So this is referring to the bodies of them, or the form of those Anya Devataha, or the demigods. So Ichhati Architum. So as soon as one desires to worship the Anya Devataha, or the forms of the demigods, I make his faith steady. So Lord is saying that Achalam Shraddham. So Lord is giving them the steady faith by which they can devote themselves to a particular deity. So as we know, there are different kinds of demigods. Even the last purport we saw that some people go and worship sun god, and we also see in Krishna book there are the residents of Vrindavan also worshipping different demigods. Although the purpose for which they worship is different, but we can see as how people worship to have a good wife, a particular deity, to have rain, they worship Indra, and in this way we see there are different demigods, a particular deity that they worship. And even in the modern day we can see as we go to villages, people have many different kinds of deities. So in each village there is one deity, one goddess whom they worship. And they think that by worshipping that goddess or the demigod in that village, they will be provided with material facilities. The rains, the prosperity, the material prosperity will be good. So they keep worshipping a specific demigod. So in this way we can see that the Lord is mentioning here that Aham, I am the one who actually makes this faith steady in them, as which so that by which they can devote themselves to some particular deity. So here it is very important to note that without the Lord's mercy, without Lord's involvement, one cannot even worship the demigods. And therefore, it is very important to note in this translation that Prabhupada is writing, I am in everyone's heart as the super soul. Although actually this is not exactly found in the word-to-word meaning, I am in everyone's heart as a super soul is not really we can find from the word-to-word meaning. But this addition is very important for us to understand that the role of the Lord is present everywhere. And a pure devotee of the Lord, as we know, he sees the presence of the Lord everywhere. And even here, Prabhupada is making that idea explicit of the role of the Supreme Lord. And here, although as we know in various other verses, Lord mentions in Bhagavad Gita, Sarvasya chaham hridi sannivishto. I am present in everyone's heart. Similarly, Lord also says, Ishvara sarva bhutanam hiddeshe tishtati Arjuna. So, sarva bhutanam. So, the Lord is present in all living entities. In the heart, hiddeshe, in the heart of all living entities. And that is what Prabhupada is also translating here. And Prabhupada is saying, I am in everyone's heart as a super soul. So the Lord is present as a super soul. This is a very important point. Unless one doesn't understand this, one cannot make actually progressive advancement in spiritual life. So as we also see in 18.61, Ishvara Sarva Bhutanam Hriddesha Arjuna Tishtati, Prabhupada gives a wonderful purport saying why it is important to understand the presence of Paramatma. So first let us try to understand what is the significance of this I am in everyone's heart as a super soul. So the idea that Mayavadis have that they are equal to the Lord and there is no one else except Brahman, and they equate themselves to the Supreme Lord. And therefore, they do not consider that there is someone else beyond themselves in the heart. They consider themselves to be the all in all. And therefore, they do not consider that they have to surrender to the Paramatma. They have to be conscious of the presence of Paramatma. They do not pay attention to this. But whereas devotees understand from the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, as we know, even in the 13th chapter, where the Lord is further describing about the nature, the enjoyer, and the consciousness, and the Lord explains who are the enjoyers in this body. While there is one individual enjoyer, there is also a supreme enjoyer. And who is that? Upadrashta Anumanta cha, Bharta Bhokta Maheshwaraha, Paramatmeti chapi ukto, Dehe asmin Purusha Paraha. Yet in this body there is another, a transcendental enjoyer, who is the Lord, the supreme proprietor, who exists as the overseer and permitter, and who is known as the super soul. So, Upadrashta, overseer. So, Lord, apart from the living entity, there is also the Lord who is present in the form of Paramatma. He is observing, he is overseeing, he is witnessing the different desires of the living entities. Prabhupada writes elsewhere that the Supreme Lord as Paramatma is making a note of the psychic movements of the living entity. The living entity has so many desires, and the Lord is making a note of all of them. And therefore, Lord is also giving guidance to them based upon their desires. And the desires are individuals' choices by the association that they have with the modes of material nature. They develop certain kinds of desires. They develop certain kinds of faith. And based upon that, they start to desire, and based upon their desires as what they appropriately deserve, Lord also sanctions them. Anumanta, he permits. So it is very important to note that the Lord is witnessing all of our desires. It is said, the example is given that just like the aroma of the flower can be felt even little further, and one can understand the presence of the flower, similarly, the Lord can actually sense the desires of the living entity. And therefore, we have to be very, very careful in our desires. Also, we have to be very, very careful with our dealings with all other living entities. Because Lord is present in Sarva Bhutanam, in all the living entities. This is a very unique aspect of the Lord, that the Lord accompanies the living entity in the material world in all forms of life, be it a small insect, a small ant, or Lord Brahma, or any other living entity in the material world. The Lord accompanies them, and Lord is guiding them. So it is very important that when we are also acting with other living entities, we have to take a note that the Lord is paying attention, Lord is observing, Lord is witnessing. What are we doing? Are we troubling another living entity? Or as we see in the chapter 12 of Bhagavad Gita, Lord talks about different kinds of qualities of people, qualities of devotees, which are very dear to him, or devotees who are dear to him because of different qualities. And one of them is that the devotee does not put others in distress, or does not put others into anxiety. And devotee is aware that the Lord is present in the heart. How can I trouble any other living entity? Because the Lord is equally disposed to everyone. Lord is very merciful and kind upon all the living entities. And a devotee knows that the Lord is residing in everyone's heart, and therefore I cannot create any trouble. Neither one can even desire to create any trouble to anyone. So this idea that the Lord is present in everyone's heart, in my own heart, is a very important realization one has to strengthen, by which one can become very, very alert. Just like when we see, when we are alone, we can be little bit mischievous, we can be frivolous. But as soon as we come in the company of other people, we become immediately alert. Oh, there are so many people watching me, and therefore I should act in a specific way. I cannot act the way I want in my room. So one becomes very formal, one becomes very attentive to what one is doing. Similarly, we must recognize that the Lord who is seated in our heart is actually taking note of everything. But when we are not aware of this fact, we are working in ways which are against the wish of the Lord, against things, without realizing the presence of the Lord, we are ignoring the Lord, or we are not acting the right way because we are not conscious of the Lord as Paramatma. Therefore, it is very, very important that we have to pay attention to this point, that Lord is present in everyone's heart as a super soul. Anyone who makes note of this, Prabhupada says that immediately they start to surrender into the Supreme Lord, the super soul, because the living entity is Anu and the Lord is Vibhu. The living entity, being tiny, is prone to forgetfulness of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and therefore in contact with the modes of material nature, the living entity starts to act in very different ways based upon the modes that one is in contact with. And those activities based upon the different modes, just like it is said, the person who is acting based on the modes of ignorance, his destination is towards lower species of life. And person who is acting based upon the modes of passion, he is creating more and more distress. So the living entity is creating distress for oneself and also creating distress for others, because working in passion. Whereas working mode of goodness is preferable for the advancement in spiritual life, but actually one who is in the mode of pure goodness, one who is in contact with the super soul, when one is functioning in relationship with the super soul, then one's activities are all liberating. They are all spiritual activities, because one is acting as an agent under the direction of the Supreme Lord. One is no more independently working for any other reason, but only for the reason that one as being part and parcel of the Lord, one as an instrument, as one functioning under the direction of the Supreme Lord, one is acting. That acting is bhakti. And in that state, there is no reaction. And therefore, the living entity can become free. Otherwise, every activity is driven by some modes of material nature. And that mode of material nature is based upon one of the modes we are driven in this material world in different ways. So therefore, this idea that the Lord as Paramatma is a very important idea. It is also important to recognize that, as we see in Brahma Samhita, that the Lord is not only present in everyone's heart, but the Lord is present as Paramatma in every atom. Therefore, the Lord is existing everywhere. So, it is very important that even if we become cognizant that the Lord is omnipresent as Paramatma, then we become very alert, we become very careful in our activities. And also, when we recognize the supremacy of the Supreme Lord being present everywhere, we also can understand that we need to take instructions from the Lord seated in the heart. And by that, we actually live the real happy life. As Prabhupada says in the end of this purport, man should give up all other engagements and fully surrender unto him. That will make man happy. So that surrender to the super soul, unless one does not know that the super soul exists, that the position of the super soul is so exalted, he is unaffected by any of the material modes. Although he is present in the material world in the form of Paramatma along with the living entity, the Jivatma, but the Lord as super soul, Antaryami, he is unaffected by any of the material qualities. And he is the perfect leader, he is the perfect guide who can help the living entity cross over the ignorance and the suffering. And therefore, by recognizing that, one needs to surrender. But the Lord is so merciful that Lord gives certain amount of independence. So Prabhupada writes in the purport, Lord has given independence to everyone. Although the Lord can do anything and everything, but the Lord, respecting the living entity's free will, has given some tiny independence. And Prabhupada, so in the translation, the Lord is saying, Prabhupada is saying that as soon as one desires to worship the demigods, I make his faith steady so that he can devote himself to particular deity. So because of this independence which the Lord has given to everyone, even if one is not willing to worship the Lord directly, but the living entity is willing to worship someone else, some other demigod, the Lord very mercifully is allowing the living entity to develop certain faith so that he can devote himself to a particular deity. So some important points to note is that without the presence of the Lord, the living entity actually cannot do anything. Living entity may think that I can do anything. I can do anything with my body, I can do anything with the world, but our own existence is dependent upon the Lord. As soon as the Lord withdraws the power, our hand cannot move, we cannot move, even nothing can move. So it is very important that without the sanction of the Lord, not even a blade of grass moves. Therefore, understanding, noting that the presence of the Lord is necessary for anything to happen. And here in this case, the faith in the individual. So it is also important to recognize faith is a very, very important element. Without faith, one cannot do anything. Prabhupada says that in every step of life, faith is a necessity. Without faith, one cannot even take the next step. Prabhupada gives a wonderful example to illustrate this point. Prabhupada says that just like one goes to the barber and one has to sit there, now he is taking out his blade and is about to shave. Now that person can even cut the neck and kill the person. But one has to have the faith, although he has never met the barber, perhaps he's meeting him for the first time, but still one has to have the faith that this person will not cut my neck, but rather will shave my beard and mustache. So, in any sphere of life, that the flight that I am taking, one has to have faith. Yes, he's actually going to go to the right destination. He's actually not going to crash. It seems there was a person who slept off the pilot, and the plane was going in infinite loop, it seems, recently. And everyone was just afraid. Airport has come, but the plane is in autopilot mode and the plane is going on its own. Such a terrible situation, but still they have some faith that somewhere or the other it will land. So, in this way, everyone needs to have some faith. Otherwise, there is no activity. Sometimes people say, like yesterday we were doing book distribution, and there were some Chinese people who were there, and he seems to be a professor in Worcester Polytechnic Institute. He said, "It seems like you are selling some religious books. I do not believe in these books. I believe only in scientific journals." So then somehow the topic of consciousness came. He said, "I study the Journal of Neuroscience. I understand consciousness from there. I will not understand from your books." So even that person, when he is saying that, he is actually putting his faith in science. Even before reading that paper, even before understanding what the journal is, he has to have a faith that this science is true, or this science is giving me something valuable. And therefore, certain amount of faith is necessary in every activity. And therefore, based upon one's desires, as we see here, the Lord is giving the faith. So for some, the Lord is giving faith to become an atheist. For some, the Lord is giving faith to become the worshippers of demigod. For some, the Lord is giving the faith to worship Brahman, to worship Paramatma, that's absolute truth as Paramatma, or as Bhagavan. So based upon one's desires, one's contact of modes of material nature, Lord is accordingly steadying the faith. So it is also important to note that the idea of faith in the modern world is conceived to be a blind faith. So anything which is related, as soon as the word faith comes, people think it's all blind faith. And therefore we reject everything, anything which is associated with faith. But actually that's not true. As we see in Bhagavad Gita, how do we actually develop faith? How do we actually, why faith is necessary? First, faith is necessary to acquire knowledge. Shraddhaval labhate jnanam. Without having faith, one cannot obtain knowledge. Because even if one has to go to a school, he must have the faith that the school teacher is actually teaching something meaningful, and he will not cheat me. And therefore, to learn anything, one has to have some initial faith, without which one cannot make any advancement in any sphere of life. So similarly, Prabhupada says that how much more faith is required in the spiritual life, where the subject matter is even more finer, subtler, and more sublime. So one requires even greater faith. So how does one develop this faith? And therefore it says, Tad vidhi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. Therefore, questioning is not condemned in spiritual life. One has to question. Questioning is very much valid. But questioning must be accompanied by service and surrender. Questioning must be in the mood of understanding the idea, the instruction that is being presented by the spiritual master or by the shastras, but not to argue for the sake of argument. For the sake of argument, if one is trying to question, then one will not be able to enter into the understanding of the Vedic scriptures or the instruction of the spiritual master. On the other hand, one who renders service, that is another important principle. Simply theoretical knowledge, if one is trying to amass and just question theoretically, that is not sufficient. One cannot understand the answers. One needs to render service, because it is by that service that the knowledge is revealed in the heart. That austerity, as we see in the example of Brahma performing the austerities, and the Lord in the heart revealing the knowledge. Similarly, the spiritual master and the Supreme Lord, when they see that the living entity is actually rendering devotional service, they give the knowledge from within. So Divya Gyan Hridaya Prakashito. The transcendental knowledge is revealed in the heart of the devotees. So this is very important, that the Vedic knowledge, or the knowledge as presented in Bhagavad Gita, and also as described as presented by Srila Prabhupada, is not based on some dogmatic principles or dogmatic ideas, but rather it is based upon logic, rationality, philosophy, science, and it's a factual knowledge. But it requires proper training to fully comprehend and appreciate what this knowledge is. Therefore, by Guru, Sadhu, Shastra, and by approaching the spiritual master in the bona fide way, Prabhupada even says that one must test the spiritual master, one must see whether the spiritual master is genuine, bona fide. And similarly, the spiritual master tests the student, whether the student is really bona fide. So this idea of faith being all blind is not actually true. The actual faith is something which helps one to progressively evolve in his life. A faith which is necessary to begin, but faith is not all in all. That faith is further added with right questioning and answering, and other kinds of practices which will further develop the faith. Just like if someone is giving me the right direction, that I take the left, right, and then the left, and so, and I go to the destination. As soon as one is with little faith making first few moves, he can understand, yes, I'm actually in the right path. I'm witnessing what is being already told, and therefore I can be assured that I'm actually reaching to the destination. So similarly, the teachings of Bhagavad Gita, Bhagavatam, and the instructions of the spiritual master, by applying them with little faith, one can see further revelations. One can see further meanings and understandings of how this is not a sentimental, dogmatic principles, but rather factual truths, real knowledge of life and the truth. So that is another important point, that this faith is so important. And that's why the first statement that Prabhupada is writing, I am in everyone's heart as a super soul, is very important. Because the Lord is the Chaitya Guru. That's why we see in different places, Prabhupada, even in Chaitanya Charitamrita, it is said, Brahmanda Brahmite Kona Bhagyavan Jiv Guru Krishna Pai Bhakti Lata Bhij. So first, by the mercy of the Chaitya Guru, the Lord within the heart, the Lord is guiding the living entity to approach a pure devotee of the Lord. So based upon living entity's sincerity, based upon the desire of the living entity, the Supreme Lord is guiding the living entity to approach different spiritual teachers. So for some, they are not interested to approach spiritual teacher, so they approach science, they approach something, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, one who is sincere, by the causeless mercy of the Supreme Lord, one is connected to a pure devotee of the Lord. And again, the pure devotee of the Lord, as the external manifestation of the super soul, further guides the living entity to again make progress towards the Supreme Lord. So the role of the Chaitya Guru is very, very important. Without the mercy of Chaitya Guru, we cannot have made the first steps in our devotional life. But sometimes we may become proud. Oh, I am so great that by my own endeavors I have become spiritually strong, and so on and so forth. No. The Lord's hand without the mercy of the Lord as super soul, it is not possible for us to make even the first beginning steps to come in contact with the pure devotee of the Lord. So that's why this first statement, I mean, everyone's heart as a super soul, is very important to make sense of these verse even better. And further, the Lord is instructing in the Prabhupada is explaining that the Lord has given independence to everyone. Therefore, if a person desires to have material enjoyment and wants very sincerely to have such facilities from the material demigods, the Supreme Lord as super soul in everyone's heart understands and gives facilities to such persons. So this is another very merciful attribute of the Supreme Lord. Lord is not forcing anyone that this is the only thing that you should do. If you don't do, I'll just, use all my power to punish you, as some people think that the Lord is punishing people. No, actually, it's a living entity's free will, independence. The Lord is Swarat, is completely independent. But the living entity is being part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, it has got partial independence. Now that partial independence, as the Lord has given to the living entity, Lord is very respectful of that, and therefore Lord allows the living entity to make the choice. What is the choice? The choice is either to serve the Supreme Lord or to enjoy one's own senses. So based upon that choice, that freedom, the only one freedom, either I serve the Lord or I enjoy independent of the Lord. So that the Lord has preserved. And Lord is very merciful. If the living entity desires, oh no, I do not want to serve you, I want to do something else, then Lord also gives facilities for the living entity to enjoy. And therefore, one's desiring tendencies, one must be very careful about what one is desiring. Because we may not know, one of the Prabhupada uses a very special word, is like something known as fine conditioning. One of the attributes of the subtle conditioning is how one's desires are manifesting. So based upon the conditioning one is exposed to in a certain conditioned state, the living entity has certain kinds of desires. So as the conditioning goes away, one comes to understand one's position, then one's desires immediately change. So one of the characteristics of understanding how is one making advancement in spiritual life is also to make a note of what kind of desires do I have. So that is the usage of one's free will, and that is the right usage of one's free will is the actually bhakti. So when one is engaging one's freedom, one's independence to only serve the master and not for anything for one's own individual propensities, then one is rightly situated. If not, by asking other desires, we are only prolonging our existence in this world. And Prabhupada also gives an analogy here. As the Supreme Father of all living entities, he does not interfere with their independence, but gives all facilities so that they can fulfill their material desires. So just like a father, if one is very, very adamant, the child does not want to listen, the father may allow for some time, okay, you want to play, okay, you play. And then the child may not do well in what he is supposed to do in his education or something, and later on regrets. But unlike a material father who can just leave the child later on, but the Lord is always traveling with the living entity and always trying to guide the living entity back to its original position. But the Lord is so kind. Lord never leaves the living entity. And someone may still question why the all-powerful God gives facilities to the living entities for enjoying this material world, and so lets them fall into the trap of the illusory energy. And Prabhupada says, because there is no meaning of independence if the Lord is controlling everything on the living entity. So this is necessary in order for the living entity. So for the idea of love to exist, there has to be independence. If there is only force, the idea of love does not exist. And the Lord wants us to develop that original tendency, the original consciousness of loving God in us. And therefore, Lord is giving us so many instructions in the form of Bhagavad Gita, Srimad Bhagavatam, Chaitanya Charitamrita. He is sending time and time again various pure devotees of the Lord so that we become attracted to Him. While our desire is leading us to the material world, but the Lord, being merciful, is providing us with various instructions, various facilities to also come to help us to reclaim to our original position. And as we become sincere and follow the instructions of the pure devotee of the Lord, then our desires get purified. Our tendencies to enjoy the material world vanquishes. And soon we elevate from the lower modes to mode of goodness and make further progress to the mode of pure goodness. That is necessary. Without being in the mode of pure, at least in the mode of goodness, our actions are all driven by passion and ignorance. In passion, we do not know, we are not really thinking why we are doing what we are doing. Is it spiritually good? It is not good. We labor very, very hard, simply giving trouble to our body and endangering our spiritual life. And ignorance, there is no activity at all. So at least if one comes to the mode of goodness, then one can make little saner decisions. Is this helpful for my spiritual life? I'm doing so much of a big event, this, that, so many things I'm doing, I'm working here and there. Is that really necessary? If one is not making attention but simply working like an ass, where is the time to make any spiritual progress? Where is the time to perform any spiritual activities? Therefore, this independence is given, but in the association of devotees, by associating with Prabhupada's Vani, books, we need to strengthen our understanding of our life and also desire appropriately. Because without having appropriate desires, the Lord, by His merciful predisposition, He allows us to enjoy the way we want. But when we take shelter of a pure devotee, our desires get purified by the instructions, and also simply by listening to Prabhupada, we are actually following the instructions of the Super Soul. And therefore, we are freed from the miserable conditions or the reactions of our actions. Therefore, He gives everyone full independence, whatever one likes. But His ultimate instruction we find in the Bhagavad Gita: man should give up all other engagements and fully surrender unto Him. That will make man happy. So again we see Prabhupada is bringing together the idea of demigods is only a partial idea, that if I worship demigods, it is all in all, is not true. The complete instruction of Bhagavad Gita, if one reads carefully, one can see that the real instruction, the concluding instruction is that one must surrender to the Supreme Lord. That is the only way for one to become happy. So, in all spheres of life, the presence of the Lord is the factor which is helping one move forward. And if that Lord is the one who is so merciful and kind and bestowing us with everything, why not we surrender unto Him directly? Then all perfection is naturally achieved. So I'll stop here and see if there are any questions or comments. Okay. If there are no questions or comments, we'll stop here. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavad Gita ki Nitai Gaur Premanande Hari Hari Bol. Thank you all for joining. Hare Krishna.